The book is it's a collection of my columns as books editor at the Mobile Press Register over a 17-year period from the mid-90s up to 2012. And it started when I began a friendship with the managing editor at the newspaper at the time, a wonderful man named Bailey Thompson. And Bailey really wanted to sort of build the local books page into something that would be a little more substantive than we had had in the past. And he knew that I was interested in books. We had talked about those things. And so he said, why don't you take on this column, do about 700 words a week, and just let's start a conversation with our local readers about books and writers, similar to what C-SPAN's Book TV does. And so that's how it began. My mandate was to cover local writers and regional writers, but beyond that, anything I wanted to do. The wonderful thing about the Gulf Coast is it's I think, so underappreciated, and that's good because it gives us a lot to write about. If we were in New York or San Francisco or Chicago, those cities and places are all so well known, and of course New York is the literary capital, but here on the Gulf Coast, and we tend to think of that, say, from Texas to the Florida Panhandle, there really is a pan-Gulf sensibility. We have a similar environment, similar types of trees, live oaks, longleaf pines, palm trees, sandy soil, salt in the air. The Gulf of Mexico, of course, nourishes and supplies us with wonderful seafood. Estuaries and rivers and places like Mobile Bay are wonderfully rich in tradition and culture. And there have been books and memoirs and so forth sort of in and around all these things for hundreds of years. So it's an extraordinarily rich subject to take. And then, of course, along comes the oil spill in 2010, where all of a sudden we are at center stage and people are beginning to look at the Gulf Coast and think about, wow, what's it like there, or what moves them, or what, we didn't know we got so much of our oil and gas from there, good Lord. And so the nation really became kind of tuned in to how important the Gulf is. What I also found fascinating was I never will forget an interview with a kid in Louisiana right after the spill. He was a fisherman's son, and the kid was like 9 years old, and he was saying, you know, this is the end of our way of life. And I thought, wow, how many American kids talk about having a way of life? And yet I knew exactly what he meant. I knew it meant crawfish boils and all of the stuff that goes so colorfully with Louisiana, but also with Florida and Alabama and coastal Mississippi as well. So that we on the Alabama Gulf Coast actually feel that we have more in common with New Orleans and Pensacola than we do perhaps with Montgomery and Birmingham. So I really did want to approach it as someone with a Gulf sensibility, someone who's from here but not necessarily provincial, someone who can look at larger issues and write and talk about them, but also appreciate what we have that's special and the perspective that that gives us. There's also a section called Controversy and Censorship, because frequently, unfortunately, local school boards can be counted on to ban certain books. And as Mark Twain said, first God created idiots and then he created school boards. So when the George County, Mississippi School Board banned Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, I just had to say something about it in print. And the best way for me to imagine tackling that was to have Lenny and George on a dirt road in George County, Mississippi, happening upon an old scrap of newspaper where they see that they've been banned, and so that the children in this vicinity can't read about their struggles during the Depression. So those kinds of columns were for me very personal because it was a way to really defend literature from what I thought were ridiculous attacks. I respect and recognize that not every book is appropriate for all ages, but I did feel that Steinbeck's work is truly classic and for middle school kids ought to be freely accessible. Shamefully, a decade since I wrote that column, the book is still banned there. So if anyone from that school board is listening, please undo that injustice. Well, one of the controversies I wrote about was there was a young English professor at the University of Alabama who wrote a short story collection called The Bear Bryant Funeral Train. And it turned out that he had actually plagiarized portions of an older book called Stars Fell in Alabama, a wonderful book written in the 1930s by a man named Carl Carmer. who was actually down from the Ivy League and had lived in Tuscaloosa, but traveled all over the state and wrote about it very eloquently. And this young professor had actually, I believe, plagiarized in all innocence. He was a sort of postmodern type writer who was borrowing from earlier writings and using them in his, it was, to me, his explanations were somewhat garbled and muddled, and they said something about where modern English scholarship is. I thought, how can a PhD in English make this grave a mistake? But despite his pleas that this was innocent and let's put an errata, University of Georgia Press was the publisher. The book was withdrawn by Georgia. The copies were pulped and destroyed. This, to me, was the worst fate for any author. It's like that iconic scene in the 1960s television show Branded, where Chuck Connors is out there and they're stripping off his regalia and his insignia and breaking his sword, and you're banished. And so this young man, unfortunately, really did suffer that fate. He was fired from where he was teaching at the time, which I think was the University of Mississippi at that time. He ultimately went abroad to teach English as a second language there. And there were some people who really regretted the way that had played out, that there should have perhaps been leniency. I think from Georgia's perspective, they wanted to really protect themselves from any kind of a copyright violation. And I wasn't down on the professor per se, but I really saw it as an object lesson in the importance of giving credit where credit is due. And we all know that artists and writers have always borrowed from one another. But this was such an egregious case, I just thought, how does a PhD make that mistake? And is there something missing in the terms of how these folks are educated today? But the column was just an opportunity to ruminate. And my conclusion was that the ivory tower is not without its dungeon for people who violate plagiarism. That really still is a crime that can get you booted out, and is a very serious thing. Some things I could write easily in an hour, particularly if it was something I had been sort of mulling over in my mind and thinking about different directions in which to approach it. But the average time for a column for me was about an hour and a half. And then I would turn it over to my wife, Lynn, who's a wonderful editor. She had 4 years of Latin in high school and does not spare my feelings. If it's nonsense, she'll quickly tell me so. So I've been very fortunate there. And whatever time it would take me to read the book or perhaps interview someone or research it, but the main thing was that I just really had to have a strong enough sense or feeling about something to be able to write about it. And I think any columnist can relate to this, but sometimes you just struggle because you don't feel that strongly about a book or a particular issue, but you've got to do one that week and you've got to get it out, and those tended to be more of a slog. But if it was something I was really passionate about or that I found really engaging or interesting, for instance, the Massachusetts prep school that got rid of all its printed books and went to an all-digital format, I thought, wow, this is major. This is the first library that's done this, to my knowledge, and it's a cultural marker. And so those kinds of topics were very easy to put down on paper. It was a secondary school in Massachusetts, but it got a lot of press at the time because I think it was the first library to abandon the books. And the headmaster said something oafish like, when I see books, I see an outdated technology. But I went on to interview some people that were there and to sort of read other stories about it and the reaction of some citizens and bloggers. What was interesting, though, was that the kids there didn't open books. I mean, they were digital natives. It was all online for them, the Kindle, downloads, that sort of thing. So these books went to less privileged schools, which would be a good thing, or just given away to faculty. But I thought, this is truly troubling, because what if the power goes out? Or what if the cappuccino machine breaks down, or the big screens explode, or what if whoever the corporate overlord of all of this data is suddenly decides, well, we think Mice and Men, to take an example, is not appropriate, so we're not going to allow it to be viewed on our site. I mean, it just, to me, it brought up all kinds of potentially troubling ramifications, and it seems so final, because print really does seem permanent, even though we know it isn't. Still, it's not a bad technology. You can get it wet, you can drop it, you can spill coffee on it, you can carry it anywhere. It's still a really good technology, and I just thought we were throwing all that away because we were dazzled by the latest bright toy that's perhaps going to be obsolete in the future. I suppose I'm a Luddite, but these were the kinds of things that were happening on that digital revolutionary front that I really tried to pay a lot of attention to. One of the great things about being a book editor was that people would see it and they'd feel free to sort of talk to me about what they were reading. And I just got such a broad sense of how people are reading. And initially I don't think it occurred to me, well, who might read the column? The Tweety types or English professors or bookish chaps like myself. But I was truly astonished when stevedores, dump truck drivers, garbage truck drivers, busy urban nurses, teachers, United States senators, Jeff Sessions, bankers, university presidents, janitors, and people from all walks of life would just, through the course of my day and their day, would share what they were reading or what they were thinking. And I thought, people really do read more widely than I would have ever guessed, and more deeply. And of course, some books everybody was reading, like the Da Vinci Code or the what was the big book, the Purpose-Driven Life a few years ago. Coal Mountain, even further back, was another one. But then a lot of other people would just be reading things that would be totally surprising to me. And it was such a privilege to me to sort of get that peek into their intellectual life. And then we'll forget sitting in a little restaurant and this older man and his wife sitting there. He said, "Hey," he said, "you do the books page, don't you?" He said, "Every night before my wife and I go to bed, we have these tapes. They're called the Learning Tree. And we listen to these tapes about the democracy of ancient Athens for 45 minutes. And I thought, this is extraordinary. How would I have ever known that, to look at that guy? And they just seemed like an unassuming couple out for their dinner. And what a terrific privilege to learn about that. So I'm not a pessimist about this. Young waiters would tell me the same thing. Guy with a goatee, oh yeah, big reader, love this, that, and the other. And I just thought, because it's a private interior kind of thing, we're not always aware of how widespread it is. So I know that numbers for serious reading are in decline, and every survey shows, and all of that. But I do have hope. And I also think that book publishing hopefully will stabilize. Initially I was worried that it just seemed to be totally on the slide. Everybody was in a panic. E-books were going to be the huge new thing. But they've been much slower to catch on. And I think part of it is that the technology just isn't quite there yet. I just think books still have a lot of advantages. And of course, anybody who's over about 25 or 30 will say, I love the feel of a book, the smell of a book, that tactile sensation. I don't hear young people say that at all, because again, they're digital natives. But whether they'll migrate to the page remains to be seen. But I think books in one form or another will be with us for a long time to come.